The sea's only gifts are harsh blows, and occasionally the chance to feel strong. Now, I don't know much about the sea, but I do know that that's the way it is here. And I also know how important it is in life not necessarily to be strong, but to feel strong. To measure yourself at least once. To find yourself at least once in the most ancient of human conditions. Facing the blind, deaf stone alone, with nothing to help you but your hands and your own head.
Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Dave. Thanks for joining Bob and I for our podcast, Thriving in Dystopia. And even though we always try and be professionals, sometimes we swear. So just know that going in. All right, back again with another hiatus over with. We got the Thriving in Dystopia crew. I'm, as always, one of your two hosts, Dave Peachtree, and excited to be here today, Bob. This is kind of a dual episode. We wanted to record over Thanksgiving break, and today we sit on the day before Thanksgiving, and I kind of came up with this podcast because it is the end of one of my classes at grad school, and so this podcast is going to have a lot of information about a man named Rabindranath. How do I say it? Rabindranath Tagore, and it's
Tagore.
What's that?
Tagore,
right? Sorry. There you go, Bob. And then we're also going to be having a discussion about starting a school. And I brought you on, and this just feels like a perfect podcast for us. One, because we're podcasters, but two, because you have often dreamt about starting your own school for education. So do you want to introduce yourself a little bit, Bob?
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really exciting podcast, really interesting topic, and love to see where we go. I'm Bob Maisler. I am Dave's brother. I'm a teacher, instructor, lecturer at UC Santa Cruz and CSUMB in both their psych departments, and also at John Lewis College at UCSC, which is focused on social justice topics, and also active in the community at various locations, Sub Rosa, pop-up action, strikes, when grad students are on strike. That's what's happening at our university right now. And yeah, I'm a dreamer and schemer. I have for a long time in conversations with Dave and others have been thinking about how to start a school that is just a different model. We need a different model of education than what we've seen before. So this episode really is I'm really excited to see where we go here.
Yeah. And it will be a little clunky. It's a little bit different than our typical Thriving in Dystopia podcast, but also it never works best when I'm the expert. But today I'm the expert, and there's some good information. I think we'll just jump right on into it, if that's okay, Bob.
Yeah, go for it.
So I guess the start of this podcast is going to be a lot of information out, just sort of explaining who Tagore is. And the assignment was to pick a philosopher that we've studied over the course of the year. And I was, just to give a little information, some of my favorites were Bell Hooks and Pablo Freire. So you might hear a little bit about them as we go. They're all certainly related, as all educational philosophers have some relation to each other. And yeah, for me, like on a personal level, I feel like those two Hooks and Frere sort of like shaped me, and they like long before I was even an educator, I was shaped by those two. So it felt like that's where I was going to head because I felt like I had a lot more to say. But then the readings for class this week, we learned about Tagore, and he just really spoke to me. And it's also interesting because like as an educator, almost everybody knows who John Dewey is, right? And then there's also like a lot of other famous names going all the way back to Aristotle, but also like Jane Addams and folks like that. But I've never heard of this guy, Tagore, before this week. And I think that has a lot to do with the Western centric thinking that we live in. And it is just like a product of where we are, right? Like everyone knows who Waldorf is or Maria Montessori, all these people. But I don't think I don't think Tagore is too dissimilar. And I guess I'm also curious, Bob, did you do any research on him before coming into the podcast?
I just did a little bit of research via the interwebs, especially Wikipedia. And I also did not know who this person was, but very impressed after my brief research.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to start off with sort of the historical context of Tagore, where he was born into. And I guess I'll have a few questions. He's Bengali. So he's from the eastern part of India, sort of like Bengal butts up against Bangladesh. Is that right, Bob?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So then, and the big city in Bengal is Calcutta, which is like at the heart of like where the British Empire, imperialism was. And if I'm not mistaken, that's where Gandhi was born as well. Is that true? Maybe
I'm not totally sure.
So he's born in the late 1800s, and he like this, the whole like political movement at the time is this movement called Swadeshi. And it's this idea of like self-governing for India. And it's like this push to get the British Empire out of India. And I feel like Tagore takes an interesting stance where he's not for imperialism, and he's also not for the Swadeshi movement. So he's kind of like neutral, which I feel like I was a little bit surprised by that, because one of his quotes is that, or maybe not quote, but this idea that like the India that they're living in, that he's like a product of, is an India that he feels like needs a lot of healing. And that's sort of like the British Empire was able to like take over India because it wasn't like strong enough. And it's like an interesting moment of time for him to not take a like strong stance against the empire or against the Swadeshi movement. So I feel like, especially a little more historical context too, is that he is a poet first, more than anything. Like that, he won the Nobel Prize in poetry, and he like was writing poems at the age of 8 and coming out really strong with all of his like art and creative energies. So, and I feel like a lot of art is fueled by typically from some like political unrest and feeling towards that. But I would say that he's in a lot of ways in opposition to like the Swadeshi movement, which is like the Gandhi movement. Does that feel all right with what you know about Indian history, Bob?
That feels like I'm no expert by any means, but it feels like that. Yeah, I would just say that there's like so many different perspectives, like indigenous Indian perspectives on what to do about British colonialism. And I know we often learn like Gandhi and that's it. But I know from my research on the diversity of tactics perspective of like anti-imperial struggles that I know that India had like a lot of different tactics. So it doesn't surprise me that he wouldn't fit like cleanly anywhere.
Yeah, right. The first quote I wanted to share is that he urging Indians to accept that there can be no question of blind revolution, but of steady and purposeful education. So I think that he saw, rather than just like, I guess I feel like blind revolution feels like, what are we even building? Like he wants to see the end game before jumping in. And I feel like he focused much of his energy, like all of his energy, towards building this. I'm going to mispronounce it, but Santiniketan, which is like his whole educational system, his whole like belief system, and he's like pushing all this energy towards that, as opposed to just trying to like deconstruct the imperialist empire. He's trying to build something new. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And everything about him and his like life is so utopian. Like just for who he is, he was like, he was like born into the aristocracy, right? So he's rich. I think he's the 14th of 14 kids. He's the last kid born of his family, you know, and he lives on this like huge private estate in Bengal that's like massive and utopian and like perfect. And I feel like that context is like pretty important. His like family educated him outside of the typical public education system or even private education system. He just like lived at home, and he was like educated by aunts and uncles and older brothers and sisters and parents. And it's like this very much like, I guess like utopian ideal where you can just like, I feel like the imagery that I had about researching this guy was just like, oh man, I can just like see this like perfect little ponds that he'd sit, and like these like, you know, mango trees that he'd sit underneath as he's like thinking about the world. Right. And I guess I'm gonna like, so that's like who he is as a person. And he like, you know, at age 8, he gets his first paper published, or his first poem published. And he like thinks about his childhood. He reflects on it, and he's like, this is what I want to build. Right. So this, Santiniketan, his like schooling system that he builds this school at his parents' property. And, it's this idea that's like, it's communal living. It's this like guru style. So like, it's the idea that there's like this person in charge, this like great guru that's sitting there, that's like helping direct things, but not like being like, this is like, you have to make it to class on time. And one of the biggest things I want to hit on too is that he is like so influenced by nature and the forest school idea. What's called tapoban is like this very spiritual, connected to the earth way of like learning. And I feel like if you want to look at a typical day, it's, you know, you wake up and there's like meditation. There's like this awaiting for getting ready for the day. There's this huge creative outpouring of art, whether it's plays or dramas or dancing or poetry. Then there's like so much time in the day for like play. So like games you know, some type of games and playing with each other. Nature walks are like a huge part of the curriculum. And I feel like if I really want to paint the image, it's like this idea of like children sitting on mats under trees, and as opposed to like the sitting in chairs in classrooms. Right. And I feel like the standard classroom was like this dictator and order that's sitting in front of the classroom on this lecture stage that's just like spouting information out. And he very much like is opposed to that. The second quote I want to share from him is that he says, "One of the seminal lessons children can learn in nature is improvisational play without the ready-made." So he's like very much wanting to bring nature into like the mind frame. I feel like so much of like what we think of as educators is like, this is like, we'll give them this problem, and then once they're able to solve this problem, they can do the next thing. But I feel like that's just not how the natural world really works. And we are in the beauty of like the nature classroom is that the problems that get posed are like, you don't know what they're going to be, and it'll keep, so it like develops the brain in that way. And oh man, I really like this idea that class schedules shift because of weather, which feels like so in tune with something that I need. I feel like as we enter enter winter, I'm like, I have so much less energy, and I feel like I just kind of, there's like cold and dark days, and I feel like we're still expected to be the same person that we always are. But I love the idea that the weather can like shift what the class should be. So like learning is super flexible, it's simple, and it's always puts the child first, which is hugely revolutionary at the time, right? Even like when our mom was born, I feel like that it wasn't like a child first type of education. So and yeah, I also, typically think about what the teacher's role is, being a teacher. And he sort of describes the teacher as someone that thinks clearly, feels nobly, acts rightly, and is the moral compass of the school. Teachers teach with a love of the subject, and the value was for inspiration and not qualification. So, it also puts teachers first too, which is not always the case. And rather than, he does stress the idea that like teachers are there to serve the students, but I think it's also, he would always encourage teachers to follow their own like creative paths and like get those needs met, which is not always the case. And then students sort of like being involved with like the teacher's passion and following that passion. And I'll share my third quote that he has. It's, "We rob the children of the earth in order to teach him geography. We rob the student of language in order to teach him grammar. And the child's hunger is for epic, and he is simply supplied with facts and dates." And I feel like that sort of is at the heart of who he is as an educator. And I'm going to fast forward a lot all the way up until like sort of why Tagore speaks to me. And I feel like we are in this like renaissance of like the forest classroom or nature-based education. And I first got turned on to this through my wife, who was an outdoor educator. And she read this book called Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv. And and it's a book that I've read as well. And he talks a lot about this idea of nature deficit disorder, which is like, if you think about the context where we live today, we're like very far removed from nature. And this, like, as an educator, I feel like none of my standards, like the Colorado standards, none of them are like, you need to take the kids outside. A kid could go K through 12 and not be able to identify what a pine cone is. Or they could go K2 through 12 and never have to step foot outside, which I understand that. But I also feel like that's like a huge, just a huge deficit for the world we're living in. And yes, technology is important. And this idea of like being able to do the math and science and reading and all those things. But I feel like so much of what ails our society and us as humans, like, is just not having a connection to the natural world or the world we live in. And, in his book, Richard Louv says like a sedentary life is one of the top leading causes of death in the United States. And I like, it's not just like the leading cause of death, but it's also like all these like obesity issues are caused by not having a connection to nature. it's just like this disconnection that we have from each other comes from that stem too, right? And in his book, Louv talks about how when we like roll all the way back in time, when he's like reflecting on his childhood growing up and in suburbia, where he was able to like be outside and go catch crawdads and be with his family and friends, and just like adults spent more time outside, kids spent more time playing around outside, and we're just like becoming farther and farther disconnected to that. And the final like piece to all this is sort of where I came across all this is a guy named Joseph Cornell. He wrote a book called Sharing Nature with and it's nature awareness activities for all ages. He talks about this idea of like flow learning, which is very much in line with who you and I are as people, Bob. It's this idea of like walking and talking. We used to call it walk and squawks, because we get out there and, you know, you get the body moving and you just start grooving with each other. And this idea of like how when we would have like, I feel like a lot of our like mind frames and our like becoming politically aware and developing a critical consciousness over the years has just been so much about us having these walks in nature, or like just getting out and like, let's walk from our house to like downtown Boulder. And we would go on these long walks, and it was just like this beautiful moment for us to share with each other, like our political ideas, and it like totally grew us as people. So I feel like flow learning is a really awesome for us. And it talks about it in 4 steps, right? First, you awaken enthusiasm, you focus intention, second, and then you offer direct experience, third, and then you share inspiration. And I feel like this is at the heart of where Tagore was too, just being outside in nature and what connection is going to happen because you're not inside like a classroom or like trying to have a conversation while cooking dinner or just sharing space. And we've also remarked about that in the pandemic times, you and I, how like it's hard for us to share space across the country with each other. And we want, you know, just like being able to share space is so critical. But I feel like there's one thing to share space and there's another thing to be like connecting with nature at the same time. So that kind of wraps up all my information out, Bob. And I know that I just did a lot of talking, and my intention was to sort of ask you, what are your 3 big main takeaways or things that you might, and maybe there's not 3, but like, this idea of like, what is something that you, and also I do want to hear about like, because I know your school that you want to start is not necessarily nature based, but I kind of want to advocate because it's like against the norm, the public school norm of being stuck in the classroom all day. I just wanted to sort of do some advocacy for that and see if what's sparking for you.
Nice. Thank you, Dave. That was super interesting, and love the way you went through some of Tagore's life and philosophy and how it kind of has resonance in some of the other educators that you've come across. Yeah, I would say I think the first part that's worth thinking about is Tagore as a poet. Like, I think you're right. Like that probably first and foremost, Tagore would identify as a poet. And so that's really important to think about, like poetry as a really strong component of education, and that I think flows nicely into the other aspects that you talked about. And I think poetry is considered very optional in our current system. And yeah, I've come to poetry more and more over the years, even so much as in my research, there's a style of research that encourages the research analyst to create these poems out of interview transcripts. It's really interesting. So, and it's like, you tell this stuff to other social scientists and they look at you like you're out of your gourd or something like that. So yeah, I love this emphasis on poetry, and that's a take home message.
Do you
And maybe
incorporate poetry into your teaching at all?
I incorporate that method, that type of method of poetry, research poetry, into my qualitative method research class. And I've been, it's hard because I get in this like mode of thinking like, what are the articles that they need for this topic, and usually poetry doesn't usually even creep into my mind. I'm thinking about like book chapters and journal articles. So this is a nice reminder to get back to poetry. I think that's really important. I do try to get Audre Lorde into as many of my classes as possible. Who's the like wonderful Black feminist poet laureate. I think of New York State. She identified as a warrior poet, which is something that we like to think of ourselves as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is one thing. I think the other big thing is like, how did you call it? Like nature education, or open air education.
Yeah, I think we should sort of focus on the idea of the forest school, maybe.
Forest school. There it is. Yeah, I like that.
Because that is like the movement that's happening in the U.S. Julie worked at a forest preschool in Burlington for a little while. And that's also that the word, I can't remember it I'll find it real quick, but that is like, goes back to the roots of India. It's the Tapoban, or forest school, which of ancient India, and he sets out to develop a small alternative learning center. So it's like an indigenous model, the Tapoban.
Nice.
Anyway,
that's really important and really interesting. I love that. I think the part that I was most connecting with is it reminds me of a book called Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown. Do you know that book?
No. Tell me more. AK Press?
Yeah, I think it is AK Press. Yeah. The idea is that social movements, if they try to predict and plan and try to control the way things are going to go, that's just never going to work. But if they can listen to what can emerge, this like emergence of the possibilities of when people get together or when people are in the world, that is going to be a much more fruitful way to interact with social movements and just in the world in general. And part of that is biomimicry. And so the author is like always using these metaphors of the natural world. And I mean, like, for example, she loves mycelium and she thinks like, if we think of revolutionary potential, we need to think of mushrooms, because, a mushroom will pop up here and there like, oh, here's a rally, here's a like uprising. But actually most of the mushroom is underground and they're interconnected underground. And that's kind of actually how social movements work. So if we lose a battle over here, actually like, let's not feel like we lost the war. We still have the underground. So that's part of it. This biomimicry, if we can like both understand nature, be more in tune with nature, it's going to help us in our social movements and education. So I think it leads to what you were talking about of like, things could just free flow where they will, like that. That's the idea of emergence. And instead of like trying to get to like this particular endpoint in a class, like you have to get to this place where you can take the final and you can get everything right on the final. No, like, why don't we like get out there in the world, spark something, see which way we go. We have no idea which way this is going to go. So we couldn't possibly design a final, because we don't know where we're going.
Yeah, right. Rather than having everything like pre-mapped out for what a fourth grader needs to know by the end of the year. Like, what standards do they have to hit? Can they become, what do they need to master? What do they need to be introduced to? Being like, which is very, very John Dewey as well, right? This idea, this like progressivism in education. It's this idea that like we are going to let the students drive the conversation or drive the like, we're not seeking an end game. We're just seeking education and growth, as opposed to like being like, this is what you need to know. You need to multiply 3-digit by 1-digit numbers. And if you don't know how to do that, like you've failed. But it's like, yeah, but like they wrote this like heartwarming poem about like friendship and how to like take care of each other. And it's like, which is like another standard too, sure. But like, how are they growing as humans, right? As opposed to how are they growing on their standards.
Yeah, exactly. Which, I mean, I'm very attracted to that. I really like that. I think that's where I've learned the best and have been most excited about education. Maybe the last point is like back to the original point that you were making, or one of the original points is this too utopian?
Right.
Like, does this presuppose all kinds of resources, all kinds of privilege? Is it too pie in the sky? I hope not.
Yeah.
You know, I hope we could see this flourish in our current world. And I know we could, because, you know, there's people like Adrienne Maree Brown out there, and, you know, maybe she not necessarily in Tagore's lineage, but definitely similar ideas are being talked about these days.
Yeah. This, you know, one thing that I didn't hit on too much was like, as we all have like a somewhat working understanding of the Indian caste system, right? Like, none of the research I did really hit on it too much. I do know that like Tagore went into the rural parts of Bengal, and he like started some education systems there. So he took his education systems and tried to like get them out into the rural aspects. And he also would try, like, I know that at his like family homestead where he was doing this utopian project, it was very much like free of the caste system. But I don't know. I like, who knows how that really works, right? Like, because like when you take something that's so ingrained into like who, like, we know because we live in a white supremacist society, right? So we understand like how hard it is to like remove those concepts and like what it really means. And like, just like the book that I was reading called Ethical Visions of Education's Philosophy and Practice by David Hansen, it like basically just said they ignored the caste system, and like people came as people as opposed to people coming from their caste into the school. So like there's a huge piece of me that says, well, are you just like practicing color blindness? Is there a blindness towards the oppression that's been happened to the people that come to the school before they get there, you know? And sure, once they're there, like we can like have this utopian concept of what it's like, and that can be great and all that, but it doesn't mean it just disappears. And I feel like that's the issue that we were in, you know, I mean, we've been in for a long time in this country, but like we're moving away of this idea of like not recognizing a person's struggle is it worse than, or as bad as like aggressive racism. It's a microaggression in of itself, this color blindness. Does that feel true?
Yeah, it can. I think like some of the utopian education systems do maybe like operate under a color blindness. So I think that's really important to name. Like, how would the system take on thinking about the social structures of the outside world that will inevitably creep into this utopian system? And I think it clearly could. It's maybe just been like some of the utopian systems in the Western world have been created by white people, at least the ones that we've been coming into contact with, like the unschooling movement of the 60s or 70s as maybe like somewhat of an example. So,
or even Freire,
yeah.
right? Like he is like very much ignoring class and ignores gender. And that's like a big criticism that Bell Hooks had of Freire, right?
I think the gender one, absolutely, of Bell Hooks's criticism. I would say that Freire
deals with class. I meant race, sorry.
Trying to identify class dynamics in his works. Yep.
Good. Keep me honest, Bob.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry. I might have also interrupted your flow a little bit.
Oh yeah. No, just be interested to see how, these like the balance of structure and non-structure within such a system. Like love the non-structured to go where it will, but it seems like we would need some structures clearly, to set things up in particular ways and allow for support of, taking on certain things. Like we want to make sure that we are like a anti-oppressive school, and we don't want to just like leave that up to chance, or like if this group of students brings it up, we don't want like the students of color to have to be the ones who are introducing, like, we want to talk about racism. Like the school should say that from the start. And that's a structure. That's like a given structure at the start. So
yeah,
I believe in that, but I also am into this idea of forest education, or just like emergent strategy. Is the way that I see it these days.
Yeah. A school I worked at in Vermont, I think were very strongly based in this idea of like, I think it came out of the unschooling movement, but also like this idea of emergent strategies, or like sort of the randomness of nature that it can provide, and like had a really strong creative influence. It feels like Bridge School basically could have been a school that Tagore had like invented, you know what I mean? And
Nice.
it also felt like one of the issues at the school was like, you'd be like, yeah, like your kid just like had this amazing, like eye-opening experience, like building dominoes or something like that. Or like we went into the woods and we like, understood like how to like build a cattail mat, which was definitely a project we did. But then like a lot of times the parents are like, yeah, but like, are they reading at a third grade level? It's like, yeah, that's also like a huge concern too. Like you can't ignore that. Like you want your student to also be doing both, right? To be meeting these like amazing, having these amazing nature connection experiences, while also like making sure they're not like falling behind in like the capitalist world that we live in. And I like understand that as like a concern of parents, right? Like it's just like both. It's both.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah, it is. It's always like the question of how to get to this other model with like not just like totally ignoring the demands of the current model. Like you have to get into college, so you have to be able to do certain standards.
Totally. You have to be like, and it's a disservice to not teach a student how to read, like to just spend all day like building, like, I don't know, following a rabbit for a whole entire day is like, that's fine to do. But you also need to like, we live in a literate world, and like, we can't like, think of how much information we've accessed by being literate, like it's literally, millennia of information because we're able to read, and that like millions of other brains that we have access to and conversations that we get to have. So like you can't ignore, because you need to be able to, you and I have both been successful in this world because we've been able to, for a lot of reasons, but we've been able to go to college. To go to college, you have to be able to do all the the normal stuff. Quote, I don't know, normal is a bad word, but all the expected standards.
Precisely. Yeah. So maybe it's just like, is it possible to blend and have a balance? I think so. You know, who knows what maybe the balance is different at different places, but to start by maybe just injecting more and more Tagore educational philosophy and see where it goes. I think that seems possible. Like, could you integrate some of his stuff into your pedagogy and curriculum?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, that needs to happen, right? Because right now, and I know it's wintertime in Colorado, so it's hard, but we spend, I think the students have 45 minutes outside a day. And none of that it's all for just for play, because you got to get those needs met first. Those are the highest and most important needs. But, you know, I can even see this year compared to like previous years, how much less time I'm allowing to just go outside. So it's a good reminder for me as a teacher to be like, you know, we can go outside and do sound maps. We can go outside and just read even. We can go outside and just like lie in the grass. And even that is going to provide for unique experiences. And, you know, that's one of the things that Richard Louv says in his book. You know, he's like, we don't really know how to be bored anymore. And I feel like sometimes the best part, like dealing with like issues like ADD, is the idea that we don't know how to be bored. And I feel like students in my classroom, they don't know how to be bored. And I also recently saw a TikTok video of this teacher who's like, we need to like have 10 minutes a day where she's calling it board time. And I would rather do board time outside. It's not always possible, but like think about what board time, like how necessary that is, and like how that can, board time in nature is just like, it becomes infinite, because you get infinite possibilities to follow that emergent strategies, you know, and you can follow that path. Anyways, I feel like that's a pretty good stopping point, Bob.
Yeah, I think we could talk about this for a long, long time, but that seems like a nice place to stop. Absolutely. With a piece of what you and others could integrate into their like current practices.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, one of my assignments too is to make like a piece of nature-based curriculum or lesson plan for my day. That's like one of my assignments for this weekend. So I'm going to do that, and I'll post a link to that in the show notes. Yeah, I guess too, I picked like 3 poems that were like nature-based poems in, you know, in line with Tagore, because, you know, his view on nature and all that and what that means, but also poetry. Is it okay if I read the Whitman one, Bob, as an ending?
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. Wait, is it written for Whitman or just by Whitman?
It's yeah. The 3 I picked was, you know, I picked the Manifesto of the Mad Farmer Liberation Front by Wendell Berry. I also picked a Tagore one, but I want to read the Whitman one, if that's okay.
Okay. Yep.
I think it's called "The Child Went Forth Every Day." There was a child went forth every day, and the first object he looked upon and received with wonder or pity or love or dread, that object he became. And that object became a part of him for the day, or a certain part of the day, or for many years, or stretching cycles of years. The early lilacs became part of this child, and grass and white and red morning glories, and white and red clover, and the song of the phoebe bird, and the March born lambs, and the sow's pink faint litter, and the mare's fowl full, and the cow's calf, and the noisy brood of the barnyard, or by the mire of the pond side, and the fish suspending themselves so curiously below there, and the beautiful, curious liquid, and the water plants with their graceful flat heads, all became part of him. Bob, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Dave. This was fun.
Love you.
Love you too.
En 1140 est parti sur la mer, un ennemi poirier.
What's up, driving crew? Bob and Dave want to take a second to thank you for lending them your ears. They also want to thank the artists for making everything a little more beautiful. The intro song is In Heaven by Drake Stafford. Our audio is edited by the consummate and dexterous Nadir Chayech. Web design by Chris the Mixer Sawyer. And of course, visual art is by the prolific and enigmatic Joe Shine. The outro song to Season 8 is Captain Jacques by Kimaru Crew. Thanks for listening.
Aujourd'hui encore, on chante le refrain du pirate acadien. À l'insu des sauvages fabriquent un radeau. Un jour voyant trop large ce qu'il croyait être un bateau, on le prit à bord et en fit un pirate, commençant la légende de Jack. Captain Jack est arrivé de loin. Aujourd'hui encore on chante le refrain du pirate acadien.